Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for January 26, 2016. That's very difficult for me to say. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we're joined by Jim Clausing online. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks.
And we have Matt Kaiser here in our studio or work area. Welcome, Matt. And John Hogoboom. Welcome, John.
Good to be here.
I'm Brian Rexroad, and John, let's go right over to you here. And I guess you're gonna have to explain this to me.
Yeah, it's actually not. It's not really complicated.
Yeah.
But if you're familiar with a lot of the Intel motherboards and whatnot, a lot of times they ship with these utilities to update the drivers for various components, for various system components on that motherboard, or as well as other things that might be attached to it.
And generally, that process has been improving significantly. I think looking back, it used to be hard-coded, and then they started doing, you actually had to replace the chip, which was almost impossible to get a new one. And then
you're really dating yourself at this point.
Yeah,
go back
it's
to
pretty
those
pathetic,
days,
isn't it? But it got to the point where there weren't really any controls around the updating. We started having, basically BIOS exploits, and
right.
So roll forward.
Right. Well, it's not really a BIOS exploit per se, but they have an Intel driver update utility that runs when your machine boots, and it goes up to the internet and tries to find out, are there new drivers for various components that need to be updated. The issue here, and actually this was identified by Core Security, they put a kind of little research paper out on this. There is a CVE associated with this exploit. But in any event, basically what happens is when that utility runs, it goes and it makes a connection up to central command, I guess. I don't remember exact URL there, asking, is there a driver update for this particular piece of hardware? And it'll come back with an XML document. Now, when it makes that request, it's in HTTP format. So that's really the problem, is that it's really prone to interception or man-in-the-middle attacks. So if you took your laptop that maybe has this running and you boot it up and you're in a Wi-Fi hotspot, somebody could potentially intercept, or even, there's all kinds of ways that I could trick your machine into proxy your activity through my machine if we're both at the same Starbucks cafe. So you could do a man-in-the-middle attack there, come back with a different answer of what really you want them to update and install, and it basically just lists in XML, here's the zip file, go download this, install it, and execute it. So you could provide your own pretty quickly. It doesn't really do any kind of authentication to make sure that that's a digitally signed piece of software that it's going to run. It's doing a really basic kind of domain level check to make sure that that domain name is right, where it got it from, but that's not any measure of real security there.
So they have a fix?
They do have a fix. So they have an update for it. So I guess the reason I really brought this up is because this is a common type of update utility that a lot of people might have, especially in large businesses and enterprises. You might have a large deployment of laptops or other hardware that has this, so you might want to know about it to make sure that you go get an update for this and apply it.
Now, just out of curiosity, is this something that would take place in the background? Is the system is kind of polling to see if there are updates, or is this something that somebody would know that they're doing the update check? Well,
you will know, because it actually will run. And it'll kind of give you one of those dialog boxes that says, we have updates for this, you want to apply that kind of thing, but it will run at that elevated privilege when it goes to install itself.
Right.
So it's not completely transparent to the user, at least from what I was able to discern. I haven't tried it myself to make sure, but.
Right, but the fact that took place sort of in the background, the possibility of a man-in-the-middle attack taking place is probably greater than as if it was something you were initiating yourself and say, I'm going to do updates, having a little better framing around the security. That was kind of the context I was trying to gather here.
I guess if you were cognizant enough to be doing it at home where you believe your network's not being tampered with, I suppose that would be a good point. I personally think this is sort of like a real shame that this still sort of exists. I know these kinds of attacks have been going on for years. In fact, there's a tool called Evil Grade that was built sort of like the Metasploit of this kind of attack, where they just drop in modules and it says, oh, hey, someone made a request for this particular file that I'm aware of. I'm just going to man-in-the-middle that for you.
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. This is a case where, any solution like this, particularly doing system updates, should be protected against a man-in-the-middle type attack. And so, you should be able to know the system should know who it's talking to particularly. That was sort of my point here, is that if a person is actually doing this, they at least have the opportunity to scrutinize what is taking place. This is a case where if the system is doing it on your behalf, it has to have all the smarts to know whether it's talking to the right
But I would say,
not.
is a human being in the position to actually make that decision? Or do they have to make a decision between, yes, I want to upgrade, and no, I don't? It's not as if the update is going to say, here are your URLs to validate human being. Please tell me if these are what you're looking for. Or it might just say, click the big green button and make things better.
I think code signing would be a really helpful benefit here. I think there's a lot of things that could be accomplished security-wise by having signed code from a trusted vendor. Same way you have kind of SSL certificates for websites. I'm not going to install software unless it's signed, and that certificate that it's signed with is from a trusted authority somewhere. I think that would help weed out. Unless you're a user who just is going to get that message and say, I don't care, boom, and install it anyway. And that could still happen. But I think that would help here. I'm not quite sure what their fix does to address this, but that, in my opinion, I'm a big kind of fan of code signing. So.
Yep, I agree with you. All right, good point. So Jim, let's go, and we talk a lot about crazy dumb passwords, and I think perhaps very helpful will be to talk through a little bit about what kinds of crazy passwords the attackers are trying to use. And so take it away.
Before we talk about the ones that the attackers are going to use, though, I did want to point out SplashData came out with their list of the top 25 passwords that they saw people using this year. This comes from about 2 million passwords that were leaked in various forums on the internet. And they analyzed those. And basically, this list is what not to use for a password. I mean, they're top 25. And I talked about this a little last year, too, when the report for 2014 came out. But their top 2 passwords were the same this year as they were last year. Number 1 was 123456, and number 2 was password. Now, I don't know why anybody in their right mind would ever use those passwords anymore. But those were the top 2 passwords that they found among these 2 million leaked passwords that they saw this year. And most of the passwords on the list are the same bad passwords that people have been using all along. The highest debuting new one this year came in at number 11, and it was welcome. Well, okay, that's not a real hard password to guess either.
Well, it's actually a little contrary to what you would expect a password to be doing.
Yeah, exactly. Now, there were a couple new ones on the list this year that were 10 characters. Okay, good for you for making it a little longer, but it was 12345678890 and QWERTYUIOP. Just going right across the top line of the QWERTY keyboard.
Right.
So those are not particularly helpful. There were a couple that returned to the list after being off last year. Those were Princess and Password with a 0 for the O. The guys who did the report wanted to make a big deal out of the new ones at number 23 and 25, Solo and Star Wars. The new Star Wars movie just came out in December. Was a lot of hype about it last year, so there's talk maybe that's why it was. Princess returned to the list after a year off. But come on, people. Pick better passwords. Seriously.
Yeah, I happen to personally reflect on Let Me In because I remember using that about 20 years ago once.
Really?
And well, it didn't look exactly like that, but it was kind of close. And but now I use things like Get the Hell Out. Okay, Jim, I didn't mean to detract from your discussion.
None of these are hard to guess. They're all relatively simple. We can do better than that.
We can.
But that did get me thinking. It's been a while since I looked at what passwords the bad guys were guessing in our honeypots. So I decided it was time to go take a look at that again. So I looked at all of 2015. What did we see hitting our Kippo honeypot in 2015? Yeah, and again, I mentioned we've had the KIPO has been running since 2011, and we've actually been capturing POP3 passwords since 2009. But in 2015, we saw 2.8 million password guesses against our honeypot. That's up from 2.4 million in 2014. And to get a little sense of perspective, in the first 2 years that we had the honeypot running, we only had 300,000.
Now, I think one of the things, Jim, I wanted to point out here is that we've quickly shifted from the passwords that have been found that people are actually using. Now we're going to be talking about passwords that attackers are attempting to use against users' accounts, right?
Right. And that's a good point. The SplashData report was all what they found in leaked password lists. And what we're seeing here is what the bad guys are actually guessing when they're trying to brute force. There is some overlap, but they are two distinct sets, and they do actually exhibit some different characteristics. But looking at what we saw, for some perspective, I threw up this graph of the probes per day, and we saw an increase in probing late in the year in 2014, and that continued over into the beginning of 2015. And we saw a lot of activity in the first few months of the year. There were actually a couple of specific botnets that were doing a lot of SSH password guessing, but that all seemed to drop off around the beginning of May. There was one little spike in June, but it dropped off to levels that were the same or a little below where we had been early in 2014 before the tick up at the end of the year. So there was some drop off in that activity, but they don't know exactly why, except that those botnets appeared to have calmed down. And one of the big contributors early in the year was the Linux XOR DDoS botnet that was scanning for Linux boxes, exploiting them, turning them into scanners, and we saw a lot of that activity early in the year. That pretty much dropped off the face of the map later in the year.
Hey Jim, does this include telnet password guessing as well as SSH?
No, this is only SSH.
Okay.
I don't have a good telnet honeypot to feed into the same database. That's something actually I've been thinking would be nice to add because of some of the traffic we've been seeing, with the increase in port 23 traffic in the internet weather for the last 6 months. Mm-hmm. But I haven't added it yet, and that's something I may try to get in there for next year.
Okay.
The next chart I have here is the top 10 passwords that we saw in 2014, again, just for comparison purposes. And you'll notice in the top 10 there were 4 variations on the word password. Password 1, with the capital P, the @ sign, the 0, and just the 0. When you look at what we saw in 2015, that changed quite a bit. Still 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 was the top of the list. That may be a little unfair. That is the actual hard-coded password in the KIPO honeypot. If they guessed that one, they actually got in, and then we were able to watch them, see what they wanted to do. Mm-hmm. But the rest of them, admin, root, password is still there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, support, default, UBNT, folks looking for Ubuntu systems, and user.
I think that's
actually now the UBNT is it's a type of firm. I mean, it's an embedded device or something, right?
I think it's Ubiquiti network hardware.
Yeah.
Right. So there was some change this year in the passwords they were guessing, though. It wasn't 4 variations on the word password. They tried some other things. Not sure what conclusions to really draw from all of that, but there definitely was a change in what they were guessing. On the other hand, none of them in the top 15 or 20 were particularly complex or distinctive. They didn't really jump out at me when I was looking down through the list. Again, the longest passwords that were guessed, and I don't have a slide for that, were in the vicinity of 70 or 80 characters. There were a couple that were longer than that, but they weren't really passwords. It was garbage thrown in there.
Yeah, I'm curious. Do you think that might be some attempt to do a buffer overflow or something like that?
Some of the longer ones may have been, because there were things like the password hashes, the really long SHA-1 password hashes from Linux boxes, and things like that. The garbage code, if you've ever looked at a Word document as text, it's got all of that crap at the beginning to do the formatting. I saw some of that kind of garbage in there as the password attempts. So those might have been attempts at buffer overflow. The longest one that really looked like an attempt to be a password was some random hex, or maybe it was base 64 stuff that was about 70 characters long.
I think perhaps the other possibility that you see that perhaps we kind of assume not, but I mean, the possibility of coding errors or installing the dictionary incorrectly or something like that, and somebody just not realizing that they're using garbage password guesses as a possibility as well.
Yep, that is also a distinct possibility.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things was to look at the usernames that they were trying. Since SSH often is on Linux, Unix type boxes, the top username that folks were trying was root. Not particularly a surprise. What was kind of a surprise to me was the second most popular one against our Honeypot again. Was a full order of magnitude less attempts, and that was admin. And third on the list was another order of magnitude, or no, that was 2 orders of magnitude smaller. The third one was another order of magnitude smaller than that, and that was UBNT. And then administrator, user were all in that same. So by several orders of magnitude, the biggest, the most guessed username or most attempted username was root. As I said, not particularly surprising, since SSH you normally think of as being a Linux, Unix type thing, and all of these embedded routers and security camera DVRs and all of that are running a small embedded Linux. Well, root is going to be the account that you're going to go after. That's going to be the one that has all of the power.
Yep, you got it. And I think it's always been sort of said that like they recommend on Windows systems to change the administrator account name to something else, and in Linux or Unix systems they recommend that you block direct access to the root account, that you have to log in as a user and then SU to root privileges if that's what you need. And this puts numbers behind the recommendation.
Yep.
Well, in general, you
Yep,
should be
absolutely.
logging in as root remotely in most cases anyway. Obviously not directly.
And a lot of these embedded device vendors, they,
Haven't bothered.
while you can set up SSH very easily to permit root login, set it to no, it's usually they do not. So, and it's, I think, just a convenience thing, because it would confuse a lot of novice users if they had to log in as a regular account and then SU to become root. So anyway, I understand probably why they do it, but I don't think it's the right thing to do.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the next thing that I decided to take a look at was what SSH clients they were using. And granted, some of the time it may be a script that is claiming to be something different than what's actually showing up here. But the top SSH client by far was showing up as being PuTTY, which, we're all familiar with PuTTY. That's a free SSH client you can get for Windows. But the next one on the list was libSSH2, one version of libSSH2, and that was almost 2 orders of magnitude smaller number. Those were certainly scripted, the libSSH2 ones. Didn't know what really to make of it. It just was kind of interesting. Last year it was similar. PuTTY was far and away the largest one, but the next 3 after that were libSSH. These JSCH ones that are showing up here in 3rd and 4th place this year, I am not familiar with that. I believe that that's another library that you can use for scripting. Those actually showed up last year, but they were down around 8 and 9, so they've moved up in popularity this year. The next thing I looked at was the top 10 IPs doing the probing.
So Jim, before you go on to that, sorry for the interruption, I did have a sort of a question on this. So on this is looking at the client sides that are coming in, and I don't expect that you have the answer to this, but for folks that are listening, they may find this slightly interesting. It would be interesting to see how the distribution of password guessing might change if you had a different login prompt. So if you have a particular login prompt that's showing up on your Linux machine, perhaps there will be a different login prompt that you get from maybe a router device or something like that. And it'd be interesting if that changed how the password guessing occurred. It might not have a big change in the distribution, but I'm wondering to what extent the attackers are actually looking at the login prompt to look for indicators of that type.
Yeah, it's a non-zero. There is some change because when we talked about that net screen SSH backdoor a few weeks ago, I had some friends, including Johannes Ulrich over at the Internet Storm Center, who changed the prompt that his Kippo Honeypot gave back to claim to be one of the net screens. And once he did that, he did actually see some attempts to use the backdoor password for net screen, which he did not see when he was not using that string in the prompt. So you're right. It might not change it significantly, but there are definitely cases where folks are looking for it in order to exploit
specific
particular backdoors that are known to exist.
Yep. Okay, good. Thank you.
So next I looked at the top 10 IPs that were doing it, and most of these are actually the same ones that we saw in 2014, and it was all, these top 10 were all the ones that were doing the scanning at the beginning of the year when we saw those big spikes. These were all the botnets that were doing that scanning back at the beginning of the year. And the last thing that I thought was kind of interesting is when the folks actually did successfully log in. Again, the Kippo Honeypot, the default password is 123456, and if they get in, then we log what it is that they try to do. So these are the top 10 commands that they tried to execute if they actually got in. And the first 4 of them were attempts to turn off the built-in firewall in the Linux box. Service IP table stop, etc init.d IP table stop, SUSE firewall stop. So the first 4 attempts were all attempts to turn off the firewall, and the rest of them were attempts to download and or execute additional tools that they downloaded off of, that they got off internet websites. So those were their exploit tools, and obviously there was one set of them that BSSH ME tool was the most popular one that they were trying to download and execute. So.
Now, I noticed these numbers are significantly smaller. So this is the subset that basically guessed your password, got in, and started doing things. Is that correct?
Right. This is the subset that actually guessed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. then we looked at and there were about 6,400 of those if you went back to the earlier graph with the top passwords that were attempted. There were about 6,400 out of the 2.8 million attempts that were successful. And of those, not all of them actually did anything. Some of them, once they got in, they immediately logged back out. But of those then that did attempt to do something, either scripted or manually, there were some that manually typed commands in. These were the top 10 things that they attempted. And you're right, it's a much smaller number, under 500 for each of these. So anyway, I thought it was interesting, worth taking a look back at, and since that other story had reminded me we hadn't looked at them, I thought it was time we take a look.
All right, very good. Thank you, Jim. And I always find this really kind of a fascinating discussion, so I appreciate you bringing that to us. And I think perhaps we should try to do maybe quarterly updates on this type of thing, because I think it is useful information to sort of gather, and I think perhaps there are some other perspectives that we can bring to the table as well. So with that, Matt, let's go to you. And you made a resolution to do some reading.
I did.
And so I really appreciate you bringing one of your book reviews here for us today. We'll talk a little bit about Bitcoin. So go ahead and take it away, Mike.
So the first book that I picked for this year is Mastering Bitcoin by Andreas M. Antonopoulos. I hope I said that right. This was great. This was a really good way to start off the year reading an interesting book like this. It is, when it says Mastering Bitcoin, they really do mean that. I mean, you can read this book. I mean, you can read, and I've talked to John because he's gotten about halfway through it.
Yeah, I haven't gotten through all of it. But the thing I like about it is, even though you said it is very comprehensive, it's not a super long read. I just didn't get a chance to finish it. I've only gotten 2 days reading, and I got halfway through. But anyway.
So my favorite thing about the book is that it's accessible. And you can start at the beginning and you can read the first chapter, and then maybe if you want to dip your toe into each of the subsequent chapters, you'd still get a lot out of it without having to understand the nitty-gritty. But if you really want to go for it, you can. And I did. I read every word in the book. There's a lot of discussion about crypto. There's a lot of discussion about the mechanisms, hashing, and other. I don't feel like I'm not doing it justice. I would say read it definitely if you want to get that full technical aspect of it. You can either read it as a technical person, or you can just get the high level but you will learn something when you read this book regardless.
Even if you read just the first 3 chapters of this book, you're gonna understand, and you know nothing about Bitcoin, you're gonna understand Bitcoin at a very high level, and because I didn't really understand how all these different pieces connected with each other and how the transactions worked, and it really kind of clarified it. And he has really good examples in here as well, I think.
So my favorite part of it is that I would be reading this book and I would start thinking about what he was saying, and I'd come to a point and go, I feel like I need to understand more about this particular topic, and the next sentence would be, for a discussion on mining, go to page 173, and I'd be like, that is exactly where I want to go. So it's written with my kind of thought process in mind, which I appreciate. I was really excited to be reading this. It's weird to say this, but I felt like when I was reading this, I was exploring something like a whole ecosystem in depth that had been created with a lot of thought, and everything sort of flowed progressively to say, here's where you could potentially attack this, which is why we've implemented what's in the next paragraph. It feels like I went to school and I learned about computer engineering, and when I was reading TCP/IP and the intricacies of that and the different patches and the reasons why people made changes, it felt like this. It felt like I was part of that progression. So it was kind of cool. So I've learned a lot about Bitcoin from this book, a lot of things that I had never known that are kind of exciting. It's a very complicated system, but it's well enough designed that most people can still use it at the basic level of making transactions, paying people, and receiving money, that they can do it without understanding the crypto below it, which is good.
So long as you have the confidence in it.
So long as you have the confidence in it, and I know that there's plenty to be said about Bitcoin, the volatility of its value, whether it's truly anonymous. And people have made efforts to try and de-anonymize Bitcoin addresses naturally, because it has become so prevalent in ransomware and other illegal activities because of the pseudo-anonymity that it gives you. you can use it as a regular method of payment. I can have a Bitcoin address for the rest of my life and keep it that way, or I can create throwaway ones for every single transaction that I make, and it works just as well either way. I think the big thing that I learned is about mining, which I think is what people think it's some sort of mystical thing where you run something on your computer and you magically mine Bitcoins out of the air. It's actually more subtle and interesting than that. It's the process by which Bitcoin actually secures itself. So mining is the act of basically building a record of transactions that occur, validating those transactions, performing actions within them to say this is good, this guy paid this guy, doing a proof of work, building up what's called the blockchain, which is that it's that infinitely growing ledger of every transaction that's ever been made, and then doing some hashing. It's almost there's an action in there of a proof of work that's almost, it reminds me of password cracking in a way. You're trying to hash out a value to try to get the same value, the one you want, and then you finally get it and you've basically won. And it's that action and the rules of the Bitcoin network that pay out a small amount whenever you do that fastest, whenever you basically win this race.
Right.
So mining, you can make money off of it, but it's not the primary purpose. It's sort of symbiotic. The network benefits and you benefit as well. So I think that was pretty cool.
Let me ask a question here. Now, is this book focused on the technical aspects of Bitcoin, or does it talk a little bit about the ecosystem that it's
both.
Credits it? So it's both.
It will teach you the fundamentals of why it works, and then also how it works. So there are examples of when you make a Bitcoin purchase. There's a couple of little characters that are created, like there's some lady buying at a coffee shop, some guy mining Bitcoin, and each one is using an example and why you would do this and how you would do this. Some of the examples are a little bit, I guess, unbelievable. Like here's the thing.
He didn't have a criminal in there. I was disappointed.
Well, here's the one that I felt would be better fleshed out is how a normal person would obtain Bitcoin.
Right.
And the example of the everyday person who gets Bitcoin is she met her friend at the store and she gave him $5 and he assigned her Bitcoin, which assumes that you know somebody who's already using Bitcoin.
Right.
So I mean, there are places online you can go and buy it. I'll be honest, I think most people who want to use Bitcoin like it for its pseudo-anonymity, in which case you wouldn't want to tie a credit card to the Bitcoins you just bought. So,
and the important thing there that I did not know after reading the book is when you make a purchase or a transaction, like if I transfer a certain amount of Bitcoin to you, that gets put on what's called the global ledger or something. I forget the exact term for it. But it's like a ledger that has every transaction that's ever occurred. So you could go in and say for Matt's Bitcoin address, how much has he transferred and to who? And you could follow that around, that money, which is interesting, but you don't know who.
You don't know
who's who,
Yep.
right? It's just a number or an address.
Or at least if you don't bind it with something else, you don't
Right.
use
exactly.
it.
So if you're selling online and you're accepting Bitcoin as payment, obviously your address will be public record because you have to tie the identity to it.
All right.
But you could always transfer money out of that Bitcoin address to other wallets or spread it around.
Or use a mixed network
and
try and anonymize what.
It has the ability to really hide where the money is or make it very difficult to figure out where where it is unless you make some big algorithm to try to figure out all those connections between everything.
So I didn't mean to interrupt your discussion here, but just another, a colleague had identified that there are some ATMs that are starting to show up, Bitcoin ATMs. The one he had seen, he actually sent some pictures. I didn't bring them here, but maybe we can show them. But it was actually a Bitcoin ATM. I think it was in a bar in Cambridge that he pointed out. So they are starting to show up in sort of common, regular commerce areas and be accepted by more, just everyday businesses.
Well, at least in our area, I think they're still fairly rare. If you go to New York City, you'll find a couple of them with the area around there, but I don't think that they're quite as common yet.
Relatively small communities at this point. So
yes, absolutely. And I did look online there's a website that tracks where the Bitcoin ATMs are. I make no assumptions or insinuations when I say this. A lot of the places that have them seem to be smoke shops.
Curious.
Curious, absolutely. So there's been some discussion lately whether Bitcoin is dead. There was a very interesting article about people trying to. One of the main, I guess, supporters or developers had quit, basically saying Bitcoin is dead. This is ridiculous. I'm done. while I can understand why he's saying that, there's a certain block of people in miners in China that are apparently bound speed-wise. And they're like a core part of the network, and yet they're not able to make perform those transactions fast enough for the network to keep up. So it's bogging down the network. I think that the foundational technology behind Bitcoin is solid, and I think it's proven that. There's been at least 20 different articles saying Bitcoin is dead over its lifespan, and there's actually a website tracking those as well, which I found kind of humorous. So it's been dying over the years for 20 or however long it was.
I guess we should point out it is a peer-to-peer network, the way it works. So there really is no central authority to it.
Well, that's one of those funny things that I also learned is that while there's no central authority, and in theory everybody is working independently for their own best interest and for the interest of the network, there are key variables that are centrally controlled.
Right.
The difficulty of those proof of work, and I think the amount of Bitcoin paid out over time as a sort of reward, because not only can you get that Bitcoin paid out for being the first to properly mine the blockchain for each block, you can also, I'm getting off topic I think, but that value itself is designed to decrease over time. And the proof of work is also adjustable in order to keep a certain balance of a block being mined about every 10 minutes over the time, factoring in the amount of participants in the network and the amount of processing power. So it's somewhat centrally controlled in that matter, but the actual keeping of the ledger is distributed and spread wide. I could go on like this.
Yeah, well, I think it's an attestation to the value of reading the book.
Absolutely.
So you're really making the point.
The other thing I thought was interesting to me, like as a regular user that I might, like let's say I want to use Bitcoin, it seems to me, and I haven't really played around with it yet, but from if you wanted to have a Bitcoin kind of mobile wallet on your phone, it seemed like the availability of that and the usability of what's available in that space is kind of more ubiquitous than it would be to have like, I got to get a special phone that has a near field communication that I tap on it. Because they have, apps and you have your Bitcoin wallet. And if you had somebody that you wanted to share with, it's like QR codes. You just kind of scan with each other and, boop, boop, and you transfer money back and forth. So I thought that was really interesting that it's a lot more, it seemed like it would be getting into using it as a payment system would be a lot more available across various platforms. It's just a matter of having people be able to accept it at various places, like a coffee shop or wherever you go, which is, I think, still pretty rare. Or a smoke shop, I guess. Smoke shops tend to take Bitcoin.
Well, you know what they say, if you've got 16 competing standards and someone decides they've got to find a unifying standard to bring all these different things together, now you've got 17 standards.
Right.
So.
All right, very good. I'm going to have to go look at the book myself. I haven't done that yet. And I think you've definitely convinced me that it's a worthwhile read. So thank you, Matt, for bringing that.
Great, no problem.
So let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. And first item here is scan probes on port 1720 TCP. Now, typically, that's port is associated with H323. Typically, this, I think it's usually UDP that's used in this aspect of this.
Video cameras that you can hit with that.
Some video cameras? There you go. So clearly the scanning activity is relatively new. Most of the probes are from the Ukraine. You can see there's a big spike at activity on the order of hundreds of millions of probes, or at least more than 100 million probes for a short period of time. And then it's somewhat continued since then over the last week or so. So certainly video cameras, you want to pay attention to that, but there are also maybe other call control type devices that's generally associated with, in fact, I typically associate it with video communications activities, sort of call control associated with video, since most voice is using SIP, which is an alternative.
You'll find though, if you scan the internet for 1720, there are some kind of web cameras that just will start sending you a stream right away off of that.
Yeah, so it's basically a call setup transaction most likely.
Yeah, there were some recent reports of default passwords on some video conferencing systems. Don't remember the details off the top of my head, so some of the scanning may have been looking for that.
Was that the AMX backdoor that you were talking about, Jim? The one that had been apparently used in government installations?
Well, that wasn't the one I was thinking of.
Yeah. There are too many vulnerabilities to keep track of.
Too many of them, yeah. But just in the last 2 or 3 weeks.
Okay. Well, that could be an explanation behind this. Nevertheless, it's taken place, so pay attention to those remote access cameras. I think that would be something worthwhile to pay attention to. Next item here, scan probes on port 8880 TCP. This is generally, I mean, there are a number of applications that I found that were associated with this. I think it's registered to a CD database, which is intended to be, look up audio CD information on the internet, that type of thing. The thing that I found most likely is the target here is Plesk-http, which is basically, I think, like a website manager.
Yep, it's like a control panel, yeah.
Yeah, it's a control panel aspect of this. So similar to perhaps Tomcat or the Cold Fusion type. A little
it's
different.
More like for a web hosting provider, like you
Right.
would have a website and then you can go into your Plesk panel and manage your website from it.
Yeah. So, most of the probes here are from Argentina, United States, Korea. So there were, not a real large number of sources, but certainly something to pay attention to. We're in the tens of millions of probes per hour that we had been observing in this activity, and we're looking 60 days of activity here. So you can see it seems to be ramping up, relatively speaking. Next item here is bytes on source port 161 UDP. That's a simple network management protocol. We're looking at the last 30 days of activity here. This kind of activity, we're getting alerts all the time. It's associated with reflective denial of service attacks. I only pointed this out because there is a spike here, I guess, right around the middle of January, just about a week ago, a little more than a week ago, that was relatively large, up around 500 megabits per second. And this data basically represents a portion of the span of the network. So there's a good possibility that reflective denial of service attack was actually larger. And we're seeing what appears to be over the last couple of weeks, more frequent larger attacks in that activity. So two sides of this. One is you want to make sure you're protected against denial of service attacks if you aren't already. And then the second would be that if you have router infrastructure that's exposed to the internet, make sure that the SNMP interfaces are not exposed to the internet. You don't want to be responding to these types of activities and contributing to those attacks. Next item here is basically looking at the top 10 most probed ports. Not a lot of movement since last week. Standard port 23 at the top, 53413 UDP following that, 1900 UDP following that, and then SSH 22 TCP, 443 TCP, 53 UDP, 80 TCP, 445 TCP. That 1911, that was remind me again, Matt, it's the industrial protocol.
Tritium Fox.
Yeah, again, what we've seen is researchers going after that. And then 3389, that's remote desktop protocol, standard target for probing activity. So we'll take a look at the top two on the list here. Scan probes on port 23 TCP, that's telnet, looking at the last 30 days here. It's actually, down relatively speaking from what we had reported last week. I don't think it's down and finished, but certainly down from what we had seen. We've gotten back into the swing of, the college students have gone back to school in the last week or two. It's not unusual to see a little bit of a curtailment or settling down of some attack activity as folks that perhaps are have maybe a little extra time or something during the college breaks and have been doing a scanning activity. I'm not saying that that's necessarily the cause of this, change in activity, but that has been something we've traditionally observed in the past. Scan probes on port 53413 UDP. This is that netis router backdoor, most popular in Asia. We're looking at the last 90 days of activity. There was a period, and I deliberately wanted to show the period in this case here at the end of November, where there was a huge spike in the probing activity on that port. And then subsequent to that, we've seen basically some continuous activity. And this is one where they basically spray out a script. Rather than doing password guessing, this backdoor allows you to basically spray out script text in that packet. And if it hits one of these routers that has the backdoor, it will execute it. Usually the script says, download this file and do some other things, similar to what Jim was describing earlier in terms of downloading files, turn off firewall, and then execute on this script so that
they don't even have to guess a password in this case.
No password guessing here, yes, that's correct. Next thing here, top 10 most sources doing that probing. Again, not a real big change here. We've basically seen a settling down a little bit on port 23, continuation of activity on 53413, 445 activity still on there, and a lot of other ICMP activity. Usually that ICMP activity is backscatter associated with a lot of this other probing activities or denial of service attacks, things like that. So a variety of different types of ICMP, ICMP3 or ICMP 11 responses that tend to come from that. We're also seeing some ICMP0, which is basically responses to pings, as well as ICMP8, which is a request for ping. So pretty standard stuff there. I thought we'd take a quick look at the daily reconnaissance index, which basically is looking at the amount of probing activity, relatively speaking, over the last 400 days. There are two components to this. There's a component at the bottom, the blue, that's associated with the number of sources that are doing that probing activity, and then the top component in red, which is basically representing the number of probes associated with that activity. So the combination of those two are normalized relative to the amount of basically the total amount of flow activity that we're analyzing, so we can see relative changes in the number of probes relative to the amount of other activity that's taking place on the network. So long explanation here, but the two notable things. One is that we've tended to be relatively flat or down over the last few weeks here, so that's a generally good thing. And then there is a very notable spike that was, I think, on November 27th, and that is in fact the scanning event that we just showed you associated with 53413, where there was a significant amount of probing activity. So you can see how an event like that affects the daily reconnaissance index. So I tend to like thinking of this as sort of the Dow Jones or the S&P 500, where this is actually quite the opposite. We like the Dow Jones to go up, even though this is going down. This looks a little like the Dow Jones right now. But we like this to go down as opposed to up. So nevertheless, that's what the reconnaissance index looks like for the last 400 days. So that's our show for today. We'd like to thank you for joining us. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, we certainly welcome your email, your questions, your comments. Any other feedback to Matt, perhaps, about
suggestions for new books?
Suggestions for new books?
Pick the nuances I got wrong.
Pick the War and Peace of technology for Matt to review for us.
The art of computer programming.
And there you
That's
go.
it.
Nevertheless, our email address is at att-ThreatTraq@list.att.com, and you can find AT&T ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel on YouTube as well as iTunes. And you can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at ATT Security. So I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Jim Clausing. Thank you, John Hogoboom. Thank you, Matt Kaiser. I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, keep your network safe.